Thank you. Thank you, Harav. It's good to be back here again, as it always is. And today we're going to speak about Arabs and the Holocaust. The picture that was chosen for that, I think that's very classic of the meeting between Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and Adolf Hitler, Yamach Shemam, both of them, actually. I think it's very apropos because that is probably the way I'm going to dive into this topic, and we may not actually get into anything else, even though there's a lot to speak about the topic. But this seems to be the main chapter that most people are familiar with, so I think that we'll open up with that and devote some time to that. And if we have time, maybe we'll cover some other points about this interesting topic. There's the official recorder. There we go. Of the Arabs and the Holocaust. So November 28th, 1941 is when that picture was taken. It's when the one and only meeting took place between Hitler and the Mufti. The date is extremely important because basically anyone who ever talked about that meeting takes it out of context and uses it for all kinds of agendas that they may have. And today the only agenda is trying to get to the bottom of the story, so it's pretty boring. I don't have any political or religious agenda here. So let's try to unpack how that meeting took place, what came out of the meeting, and how it was misused throughout history. So, first of all, who was this? I think pretty much everyone knows who Adolf Hitler was. That doesn't need an introduction. But who is this Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and why did he want to meet with Hitler? And what facilitated the meeting, and what was he trying to accomplish? What were both of their goals? When the British took over Eretz Yisrael, Palestine, whatever term you want to use for the British mandate over Palestine, at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire is defeated, and the British establish control over this region. So they appoint, just like they did in any place in the British Empire, across the vast British Empire at the time, a British High Commissioner. So the British High Commissioner for Palestine, in light of the fact that there had just been the Balfour Declaration a couple of years earlier, in other words, the British mandate for Palestine was supposed to lead, in theory at least, to the establishment of a national Jewish home in Palestine. So the first British High Commissioner was a British Jew named Herbert Samuel, and some people saw him as some sort of messiah because this is like a Jewish governor of Palestine right after the Balfour Declaration, right after the Ottoman Empire, which did not encourage Jewish immigration, was defeated, and the enlightened and liberal British, who are going to do everything they can, they were supposed to, at least they said they would, to establish a national Jewish home in Palestine and allow Jewish immigration, which they did in the early years. So, and it's a Jewish governor. Oh my God, this is like the redemption has arrived. Like he was, and local Arabs weren't terribly excited about this whole idea of a new national Jewish home, and there were all kinds of pogroms that broke out in 1920, and then later on in 1929. And then the Great Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939, and things got worse. We're not in the history of Palestine and the British Mandate now, so I'm not going to get into too many details. But Herbert Samuel, in 1920, during the first outbreak of pogroms, he had this amazing idea. He said, let's pacify the Arabs a little bit. Let's make them important, because there's two nationalities here, there's two peoples here, and we have to deal with both. So if we give some ma'amad, we give some status to the local Palestinians, to the local communities, then they will be happy with the British, they'll be happy with the Jews, and everything will be okay. So he created a new office that had never existed before in history, called the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And he took a very, very prominent, miyuchis, well-known politician, leader of the Palestinian community, whose name was Amin al-Husseini, but he had gone to Mecca on a special pilgrimage, so he gets the title Hajj. That's what anyone who does the pilgrimage to Mecca. By the way, I mean, if you can get into Mecca, you can get that title too. They probably won't let you in, but it's anyone who does this pilgrimage. So he's Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and he is appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Didn't exactly work out the way Herbert Samuel thought he would, and al-Husseini he himself became more radicalized over time. In other words, he started off as a moderate and it became much more extreme over time, but he also riled up the masses and actually completely backfired. And again, this is not exactly the topic, the British mandate in Palestine and the Arab and Israeli conflict, the Jewish conflict at this time, but I'm just trying to see where he fits into this picture. And he becomes very radical, very extreme, very anti-Jewish, very anti-Zionist, very anti-Jewish immigration. And he not only becomes radical himself, but he radicalizes the Palestinian street, the Arab street, in Yerushalayim and other parts of Palestine. So things get considerably worse, and what he lobbied most for was ending Jewish immigration, right? He lobbied for all kinds of things, Palestinian rights and recognition. Occasionally he lobbied for killing Jews. He lobbied for all kinds of a variety of things. But he was very consistent with was no more Jewish immigration to Palestine. And he lobbied the British for that. The British ended up not liking him that much because he was violent, he was radicalized, and he was anti-British. You have to remember the Great Arab Revolt from 1936, 1939 was against the British. It was an anti-colonial, right? It was targeting the British and the British military. There were some Jews killed during the Great Arab Revolt too, but it was primarily a uprising of Palestinian nationalism against this colonial power. So that was a byproduct of this. And obviously, they didn't want Jewish immigration. They wanted it to be a Palestinian home. That is who al-Husseini is throughout the 1930s. And bear in mind that it's not a static situation. It's a very dynamic situation. Things are getting steadily worse over time, and he's getting steadily more extreme and radical and violent anti-Jewish over time. So it's a process. Okay, that's al-Husseini. Now, being that he's so anti-Jewish immigration and so anti-Jewish in general, and especially that he's anti-British, British as a colonial power, so at some point in the 1930s, he comes to see, especially after World War II begins, he comes to see that perhaps Nazi Germany will be a solution for the Arab problem. Why? Because if they knock the British Navy out of the Mediterranean and they defeat England, then there will be no more British colonial issues. And maybe Nazi Germany doesn't care about the Middle East that much. At least that's what he thought. Nazi Germany cared plenty about the Middle East. That's where the Suez Canal and oil is. But they'll give the Arabs independence, and they won't have to worry about this British issue of colonizing the Middle East. That is what al-Husseini and some other Arab leaders believed at the time. Many other Arab leaders, by the way, were anti-Nazi the same way they were anti-British. So worth noting that. Again, nothing to do with Jews. They were anti-Nazi just like they were anti-British because the Nazis were a European colonial power. The Nazi allies, the Italians, had colonies in the Arab world, Tunisia and Libya and other places. And the Nazi Germany supported the Italian colonial government policy in the Arab world. Nazi racial ideology saw Arabs as a lower race. And many Arabs had already been radicalized to the left. Communism, leftist ideologies, and fascism, Nazism is an extreme right. So there are plenty of voices in the Arab world that were anti-Nazi, not because they loved Jews or anything. There's many, many ways to be anti-Nazi. There's many, many reasons to be anti-Nazi. You don't have to be a Jew lover to be anti-Nazi. So there's many Arab leaders and intellectuals in the Arab street who are anti-Nazi Germany for a variety of reasons, because they're also colonial, because they're racist, because many Arabs are leftist, all kinds of reasons. But on the other hand, there were people like al-Husseini, and he wasn't the only one. Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia was another one, for similar reasons, because he was anti-British. And Rashid Ali in Iraq was another one. He was probably the most famous one. In fact, the Rashid Ali regime in Iraq, which tried to defeat the British colonial regime, was supported directly by Nazi Germany. So there were these Arab leaders who basically, in order to get rid of the British, aligned themselves more with Nazi Germany. So let's go back to focusing on al-Husseini. So he, now the Germany, in their efforts to defeat the British, which is in the earlier part of the war, before he goes to war with the Soviet Union, the main goal of the first 2 years of the war, again, until the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the main goal of Nazi Germany, as far as the World War II was concerned, was to defeat England. So in their efforts to defeat England, they looked for any way that they could weaken England, and especially their navy. So they looked to the Arab world, because the Suez Canal, the British colonies, the Arab oil, the route to India, which is the greatest British colony in the world, all those things, maybe if he can ingratiate himself, Hitler, Nazi Germany, to different Arab nationalist movements against England, they can ally together against England, then maybe they can make a nice little shutfus there and knock England out of the war. So he reached out to the Arab world, like I said, in Iraq with Rashid Ali and with Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia and others. And there was a Arabic language radio station in Berlin that broadcast to the Arab world on shortwave radio. There was Arabic language Nazi propaganda newspapers that were published in the Arab world, all from Germany. In other words, no Arabs were allowed to serve as journalists or reporters because Nazi Germany had to own the content. They were the ones creating propaganda for the Arab world. They wanted to decide how the message of Hitler and the Nazi party should be broadcast to the Arab world. So it's not exactly a partnership. Again, the Nazis see the Arabs as racially inferior, as a lower race, the same way they saw most of the world as a lower race. Africans and Asians and Jews are not even a lower race, right? They're Untermenschen, subhuman. Only the Aryan master race, they're the higher race. So they're not bringing in the Arabs as partners. That would never happen. But they want to do this like Kiruv, this outreach to the Arab world, and that is all going on. Again, this is all just to understand better the context, all right? So al-Husseini sees this outreach. He sees that that Hitler and Nazi Germany want to make these partnerships with the Arab world. He sees an alignment of interest because he can get rid of the British and stop, and their anti-Jewishness is a very similar thing, right? He hates Jews, Hitler hates Jews. Great, we both we both hate the British, we both hate the Jews. Common enemy. This is going to work out really great. Al-Husseini either seems to not have understood, or at least either he didn't understand this, or he thought there would be a way around it, that prior to the implementation of the final solution, remember we're in the early stages of the war, 39, 40, and early 41, right? We're before the final solution. What was the main Nazi policy to solve the Jewish question in Europe? To get the Jews out of Europe. And one of the main Nazi slogans in those early years was the Jews should leave Europe for Palestine, right? Because that's where Jews belong, at least according to Hitler. Hitler didn't have Twitter today. He would have found out that actually Jews were not supposed to be in Palestine and they should be going back to Europe. But that, he didn't have social media. He didn't know, right? So Hitler thought that the Jews belong in Palestine, not in Europe. And he wanted the Jews to leave Europe and go back to Palestine, where they're from and where they belong. And that was part of their their drive. In fact, there was a controversial agreement officially and formally signed in 1934, I believe, a year after Hitler came to power, called the Ha'avara Agreement between the Zionists, the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency for Palestine and Nazi Germany to allow German Jews to move to Palestine, to leave Germany, move to Palestine. The British had to agree to this also because of the immigration quotas, and transfer some of their assets there. In other words, they didn't have to come penniless. They were able to start businesses. And about 60,000 German Jews actually made it to Eretz Yisrael during the early years of Nazi Germany. Whoever the British let in, had the British let more in, then more would have been able to make it there as well. In any event, so this was one of the goals, was to get rid of the Jews from Europe and get them either to Palestine or somewhere else, whoever would take them in. And here, Al-Husseini's goal is to not let a single Jew immigrate to Palestine. In other words, to stop all immigration, right? So it really, those two things conflicted. Now, either, it's unclear, either he didn't get that, he simply didn't understand that, or he thought that there was a way to work it out. There was a way that we can, both come out successful by getting rid of the Jews from everywhere, which is ultimately what Hitler did do, right? So after a lot of, he came to Europe, and he was a fugitive, right? He's reaching out to, he's in a British colony, right? He's not a British citizen, but he's a subject, and he's reaching out to the Axis during wartime. That's treason. So he has to leave British territory. He comes first to Italy, he tries to meet with Mussolini and his people, and then he makes it up from Rome. He ends up in Germany, and he met with Himmler, he met with other leading Nazi officials, and finally the big goal was achieved. November 28th, 1941, he meets with Hitler himself. What happened at that meeting? Nothing much. It was not a very long meeting and not a very productive one either. Again, Hitler sees him as an inferior. He doesn't see him as a partner. He wants to see what he can extract from him. He didn't see him as someone who actually has a lot of power. There's a famous line that Stalin later said in the 1940s or 50s, when there was a protest from the Vatican that he was destroying churches and arresting Catholic priests and sending them to Siberia because communism wasn't very fond of any religion, and the Pope protested this. So someone asked Stalin, "What are you going to do about this protest from the Pope? How are you going to manage?" So he said, "How many divisions does he have in his military?" And the answer is 0. The Pope doesn't have divisions. That's basically how Hitler saw the Mufti. The Mufti is not someone with a lot of power. He doesn't have a military. If Hitler can get something out of him against the British, maybe some sabotage, destroying some British railroads or something like that, maybe intelligence, okay, Hitler will try to get that from him and maybe throw him a bone in return. But it is not a meeting of equals, at least from Hitler's perspective. All this is important for what I'm about to disprove. So so that's what happens at the meeting. They talk about Jewish immigration to Palestine. There was a disagreement there, and either he just found that out at this meeting, or he saw that that's not going to work out as far as Nazi policy and Palestinian desires are going to come out. They talked about the British. They talked about the Arab world in general, how anti-British they are, and what are they going to, where they can agree. And he offered to help galvanize support for the Nazis in the Arab world, which is the only concrete policy that came out of that. For the rest of the war, the Mufti tried to recruit not so much Arabs, more Muslims. You're familiar with the distinction. Arabs is an ethnic identity and Muslims is a religious identity. There were many Muslims in southern Europe, in the areas of the former Yugoslavia, the Balkans. Today it's like 15 different countries. So in the areas of Bosnia and Serbia and all those funny places down there in southern Europe. So there's lots of Muslims. They're not exactly Arabs. But that's where he remained for most of the rest of the war, recruiting Muslims and creating SS divisions. He recruits them to the SS, and there were Muslim SS divisions in the SS. And the Mufti was in charge of this, and he did a great job. He got a lot of Muslims involved in the SS, and they were terrible people and did terrible things that the SS tended to do. That's what the Mufti did for the rest of the war. So, mostly. So, okay, fine. Let's leave that aside for a second and jump to the post-war era. In the post-war, there's, meaning from 1945 until 2026, and it looks like for the foreseeable future it will remain this way, there's a lot of talk about Arabs and the Holocaust, Arabs in Nazi Germany, because everyone has something to say about it, because in the post-war, until today, Germans aren't the biggest enemies anymore of the Jewish people. There's all kinds of other enemies, and it's nice to make a nice clean link between the old enemy and the new enemy, and this way it can serve a lot of religious purposes, political purposes, and all kinds of other things, because then we could say there's a consistency to the hate that Jews are sustaining and are victims of, from the Nazis to the Arabs and so on. So, now not only that, but in the Arab world, in the last 40, 50 years, maybe a little more, there have been direct links to Nazi ideology. Mein Kampf is a bestseller in Arabic in the Arab world. Today, in 2026, that exists, that is real. So there are direct links. So there's a lot of talk about that as well. There is this anti-Jewish hatred, and anti-Jewish hatred in the Arab world today very often calls upon this legacy of Nazi Germany and Hitler as like he was right, he knew what to do with the Jews, Mein Kampf has the right ideology, and there is this type of language used in the Arab world from post-war, post-Holocaust until today. That exists. That's an important piece of information. Another thing that happened about 10 years ago, I don't remember the exact year, it's give or take, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years ago, something like that. The Prime Minister of the State of Israel, a fellow by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu, he was speaking at a major event, publicly, video cameras, recorders, everything, major event, and he said the following thing: Hitler did not want to kill the Jews. He did not want to do the Holocaust. I guess he thought Hitler was something like a Hasidu Mot Olam. He was trying to rescue Jews or something. And he wanted to expel them. He just wanted to expel them and get rid of them. But he had this meeting with the Mufti. And the Mufti's meeting with him on November 28th, 1941. And according to Netanyahu in this speech, the following dialogue took place. It didn't, by the way, spoiler alert, but according to him, this is what took place. Now, I'm not a politician. I'm trying to make political statements. I'm a historian. I'm trying to just share a narrative because it's important. Because when we use history for all kinds of things and we lose the story, then a lot of damage can happen. So he says this dialogue took place. What are you going to do with the Jews? Get rid of them? If you get rid of them, they're all going to come to Palestine. Then I have to deal with them because I'm in charge of Palestine. Okay, fine. And what am I going to do with them? I want to get rid of them too. So Hitler said, "Oy vey, you don't want them either. Then what are we going to do with them? I don't know. I need to get rid of them." So the Mufti said, "You know what? I just had an idea. It's the craziest thing. You might be uncomfortable with this idea. Why don't you just kill them all?" And Hitler's like, "Oh my God. That is a fantastic idea. I never thought of that." See? Go ahead, do that. You know what? We're going to do that. Thank you for this idea. I appreciate your time. I will go ahead and kill all of them. He actually said this in a speech. Okay? This is documented. You can check me on it. Obviously, I played it up a little bit just for entertainment purposes now. But he basically said that. You can look me up. What's that?
What year would that have been?
I think it's like 10, 11 years ago. I don't remember exactly. 2014, 15, something like that. I don't remember exact year. You can look it up in 2 seconds. You can find it. And therefore, who's responsible for the Holocaust? The Palestinians. Those horrible Palestinians that they don't just do terrorist attacks and all kinds of things like that. They also were the cause of the whole Holocaust, that 6 million Jews were wiped out in Europe. It's all the Palestinians. The Germans, they were great people. All they wanted to do was expel the Jews. And great, if they would have expelled the Jews, we would all have ended up here. So that would have been wonderful, right? Who wants to stay in Poland anyway? Weather's terrible, right? So now as soon as he said that, all hell broke loose. I mean, this was the most ridiculous. It's Holocaust revisionism, borderline Holocaust denial. If it would come from any Joe Schmo, it would still be bad. It's coming from the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, said publicly, not like some hot mic moment caught in a dinner conversation. He's saying this he's got speechwriters. They reviewed this. This was approved beforehand. This is insane, right? It's unbelievable. The whole world exploded when this happened. One of the more interesting things that happened was the German government lodged a protest. Hey, that was us, not the Palestinians. Sorry, we take credit for wiping out the Jews in Europe during the Holocaust. That was our responsibility. Don't blame the Palestinians for this one. Basically, every historian in the world also protested, including Yad Vashem and Israeli historians. I was working at Yad Vashem at the time, and like the whole place was buzzing. First of all, they were excited that someone was paying attention to Yad Vashem all of a sudden, right? But also because making all these jokes, maybe we should, review the whole Holocaust. We've been teaching it wrong all these years. It's really about the Palestinians, and it was a terrible situation. All jokes aside, because it really was a bad look. When the Prime Minister of the Jewish state does openly Holocaust revisionism in a public forum, and borderline Holocaust denial. So what was? I mean, his point obviously was a political agenda. He wanted to blame the Palestinians for everything. Then it looks, better for. Why should we give them a two-state solution if we can blame them for the Holocaust? They don't deserve a state, right? Even though Germany was a two-state solution after the Holocaust, right? It was two Germanys. But what was behind that? So first of all, how do we know he's wrong? Maybe he's right. So the first thing is that the conversation never took place. We know what happened at the meeting. It's, these meetings with Hitler were very formal and official, with note takers and translators, and these are all documented. That's first of all. Second of all, November 20. Remember, I told you you have to remember the date. November 28th, 1941. Okay. In June 22nd, 1941, which is before November last time I checked, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Following the German army in the Soviet Union, there was 4 SS units called Einsatzgruppen, which started mass murdering Jews in every single town and city that the German army came into. So, Soviet Jews would have been very surprised to find out that Hitler got the idea of killing Jews from the Mufti when they had already been killed for the last 4 or 5 months. Right? So the Holocaust was in full scale. It wasn't formally the final solution in June, but there was hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews who had already been shot into pits by November 28th, 1941. That's number one. So the idea that mass murder of Jews was part of the Nazi program was already on the ground. Secondly, the formal solution, the final solution had already been formally adopted by November 28th. We know today that it took place sometime in October, November. We can't pinpoint a date, but almost for sure before November 1928. How do we know that? Because Chelmno, the first death camp, did its first gassings a week after this meeting. That means that we know how the Chelmno had already been given, the SS in charge of building death camps had already been involved in constructing the mechanisms of gassing Jews at Chelmno, outside of Lodz, the first death camp, a few months before. And they were basically ready to start gassing Jews. A week later, they actually started gassing them. So Chelmno was basically up and running by this point. So there was already a real death camp to formally start mass gassing Jews in Poland just a week away when this meeting took place. Thirdly, an even bigger death camp, a much more stable death camp, Chelmno was a gas vans, Belzec, which was the first death camp that actually was a standalone camp with its own gas chambers, was already under construction in November. They already had the papers for it, they already had the plans for it, and it was just going to take a few months till March until it was actually operating, March 1942. So it was a few months later that it would actually be operating, but Belzec was already being planned. So we know that's wrong. We know that it wasn't. We know that wasn't the idea to kill Jews didn't come from the Mufti. At the same time, obviously, the Mufti he was very happy about the killing of Jews. After the war, he would deny that he had known about the extermination of European Jewry while he was in Berlin and while he was involved with the Nazis and recruiting Bosnian Muslims to the SS units. He would deny it. He also became irrelevant after the war for a whole bunch of other reasons. Even in the Palestinian world, he's no longer seen as some great leader for a whole bunch of other reasons. But he would now. His denials are probably false. First of all, the amount of relationships he had with top-notch Nazis later on in the war, with Himmler, with Eichmann, with others, we know visits that he did to camps, right? So he actually saw things in the camps. So he definitely knew what was going on. But again, he's a nobody. He's not someone in charge. He's not someone with any power. He's not someone who actually did anything besides for propaganda. Maybe a little bit of anti-British intelligence, like he told them about some, British installations in the Mediterranean, things like that, and recruiting Bosnian Muslims to this cause. But I want to say another two things on this topic of the Mufti, maybe more than two, at least two. We'll see before we try to cover some other areas of the Arab world. Number one, we spoke about Yad Vashem and how they protested it. What Yad Vashem did not want to say was that they were part of the problem. Because there's two Yad Vashems. There's the old Yad Vashem and the new Yad Vashem. The old Yad Vashem, which is the Yad Vashem before the 1990s, 1970s, 80s, even 60s there wasn't really much going on there. But let's say for about a period of 25, 30 years, until the mid-90s or so, Yad Vashem was less a proper formal, academic, historical museum that just told the historical narrative without any agenda, and it had things to say about the world. In other words, they had an agenda. They had all kinds of agendas, and this lecture is not about Yad Vashem, so I'm not going to speak about their other agendas that they had at the time. Today, Yad Vashem is a much more respected institution, and they try to stay away from politics and all kinds of other things. But the Yad Vashem had some problems back then with their agendas. And if anyone went to the old Yad Vashem museum before the mid-90s, there was this massive, huge picture of that meeting, that exact picture and it was like floor to ceiling. It was like, I don't know what to compare it to. What? Yeah, almost like a billboard. It was like so in your face. I remember it personally, but everyone talked about it also. And the point was to show this is a central moment of the Holocaust. This is a unity between the medieval anti-Semitism of Christian Europe and the anti-Semitism of the Muslim Arab world, and they're coming together, and when you bring the forces of evil like that of the two sides of the world, it's unleashed on the Jewish people, and the only thing that happens from that is the gas chambers of Auschwitz. This is the ultimate Churban, because this is a union of these two worlds. That was the message that they gave over. And obviously they backtracked from that. And in the Yad Vashem Museum today, there's in the one exhibit, which most people miss because it's like a kind of on the side, there's this little picture about that big of the Mufti at the head of a Bosnian Muslim SS brigade that he recruited. And he's giving a Hail Hitler salute, Nazi salute. And that is his place in the story of the Holocaust. Doesn't make him a good guy. He definitely wasn't. Not in the Holocaust and not in anything else he did. You won't find me or anyone else saying anything positive about the guy. But he didn't cause the Holocaust. That's not him. Right? It's not that meeting didn't really do anything. Not only that, but it went to the religious world too. And I don't mind calling out the prime minister, but I feel uncomfortable calling out rabbis. Mostly because I want to get hired back here to speak again. But there have been rabbis over the course of the last 80 years who, I don't blame them. They didn't study history. They didn't know. It's not their fault. I don't blame anybody. They built Teiras and Shmuzin and about this Yishmael and Esav. And Yishmael and Esav is two types of sinna and the two types of Kaiches Hatuma. And this meeting showed how these two things, that it's 1,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism, and Hitler's kind of like ending it. Oh, look, we got rid of the Jews, now we're handing over the torch to you, and you're going to start then. Since the Holocaust, it's been all Yishmael, sin and anti-Semitism, and there's different ways to fight it. What type of tikkun do we need to do, if it's Yishmael, if it's Esav, and it's all about this meeting. And, I mean, again, I can't argue with the Torah because I don't know Torah, I don't know the Kabbalah, I don't know, there's a lot of Torah it's based on, and I'm sure all of that is correct. I'm 100% sure, because these great tzaddikim who spoke about it know tons of Torah. They're really, really good. And I'm sure all that is true. But don't base it on this meeting. It's nothing to do with this meeting, right? So the Torah is true. You don't need me to tell you the Torah is true. You know. The Torah is always true. And there's no suffix about that. But it had nothing to do with the Holocaust and nothing to do with this meeting. Nothing happened in the Holocaust that was a Yishmael, an Arab, and Muslim that caused and led to the Holocaust, as if Hitler needed them, as if Hitler respected them, as if Hitler could care less about them. That's, I think we wrapped up the Mufti issue. In recent years...
One thing, many that see might not know, that Netanyahu's father was a very respected historian, which makes it all strange.
He was, very. Ben Zion Netanyahu. He lived till like 100 years old or something, and he wrote some fantastic books.
Him and was he alive when this thing was Ben Zion still
alive?
Oh,
could be. I don't know. That's worth checking.
He must have taken his father's something down.
So in recent years, we have Yom HaShoah in Israel, and it's for the Korbanot Shoah. In recent years, they've added a phrase to it. Not only for Korbanot Shoah, Korbanot Shoah is victims of the Holocaust, right? It's Korbanot Pu'ulot Eva or terror B'tkufa HaNatzit, which is a very complicated, convoluted term. And basically what it means is victims of anti-Semitism during the Nazi period. What does that mean? And who are they trying to include? And why would they change it in the last few years? Israeli society today is about 50% descendants from Europe, which are sometimes called Ashkenazim. Whether that's an accurate term or not, we'll discuss another time. And the other 50%, and growing, soon it's going to be an overwhelming majority, is descendants of those who come from Muslim lands, which are sometimes referred to as Sephardim, which is definitely not an accurate term, but we'll save that for another time also, right? So when we think about the Holocaust, we very often think about, this was some sort of Ashkenazi story. Unfortunately for us, Hitler believed in the unity of the Jewish people more than we do. So he couldn't care less if a person is Ashkenazi or Sephardi. And he killed plenty of Sephardim too. But the idea is that the Nazi occupation was very much less in the Muslim lands. It was in Greece and Bosnia and Southern Europe where there were a lot of Sephardim. France had some Sephardim. Romania had some Sephardim, right? But there was Rommel in North Africa, but it was a very short time. There were camps there. I spoke about that here once, also a few years ago. There were some camps there, but there was no gas chambers, there was no deportation. Very little. There was a drop of that also. Very little, right? And in many Muslim lands, there was no Nazi occupation. There was no Nazi occupation in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, many other countries. Morocco, not really. Vichy France. The Jews there were safe from Nazi occupation, from the gas chambers. There were instances, though, during the years of World War II, where there were anti-Jewish pogroms in these countries. And there were Jews killed. And the question arose about 50 years after the Holocaust. For many years, no one even had this question. Are these related to some sort of environmental thing that the Nazis, being that they created such a atmosphere of anti-Semitism, that it's legitimate to kill Jews, that it's legitimate that Jews are subhuman, they're not part of society, and they can be persecuted, and they have no rights. They were very successful at creating this environment throughout the world. So any anti-Semitic attack against Jews during this time, even if it was not under Nazi occupation, can that be related to, or at least inspired by, the Nazis and the Holocaust? And therefore, these are sort of Holocaust victims. And that became a big debate, and it's still debated today. Yom HaShoah today recognizes those victims as, they won't go so far to say that they're Holocaust victims, but they'll be included as korbanot, victims of anti-Semitism during the Nazi time period. That's how they call it, to get around this issue. What is the main story of this? There are many small ones, but what is the main big one that we talk about? And this is a very important story because this is a very strong argument to say that it is related to Nazi anti-Semitism. Is something known as the Farhud. The Farhud. What was the Farhud? On Shavuos. We just had Shavuos a couple of weeks ago. June 1st and 2nd, 1941. So in Baghdad, in Iraq, there was this massacre, a huge pogrom against Jews. Unclear how many were killed until today. The lowest estimate is 180. Most agree it was around 200, and it was even more than that. So that's a huge number of Jews killed. That's a terrible, if you think about it, one of the largest murders of Jews in the history, in modern history of the Muslim world, right? In the pre-state era. 200 Jews. That's a very, very significant, and it was a huge tragedy. It shook up, and many hundreds more injured, and Jewish businesses destroyed, and homes ransacked, and property damaged. If we add on the whole thing, and of course all kinds of other crimes, which we don't have to get too graphic about, what they did to Iraqi Jewish women during this terrible pogrom. It was horrible, a horrible, horrible pogrom. Why would that be related to Nazi anti-Semitism and the Arab world and the Holocaust? Because that would make it a very important story. Because it probably is. What happens is that Iraq is basically a British colony. It's a quasi-British colony before the war. And there's Iraqi nationalism. Iraqis want independence from England. They don't want to be colonized. So they hate the British. And there's a lot of back and forth about this in the 1930s, as there are in many parts of the British Empire, right? There's nothing unique about the Arab world or about Iraq. An anti-British sentiment. Once the war starts, so England is on one side. So again, very similar to the Mufti, there was a movement within Iraq that wanted to support the Nazis because they are anti-British, and maybe the Nazis will give them independence if they help get rid of the British. again, if you look at a map where Iraq is situated, right? If Hitler is planning, this is early 1941, so he hadn't yet invaded the Soviet Union, but if he planned on invading the Soviet Union and getting down to the Crimea, where there's oil fields, and crossing the Black Sea, and then linking with armies of Rommel in North Africa that would cross the Suez Canal and get to the Arabian oil fields, the Gulf oil fields, then Iraq is a crucial piece of that puzzle, and that would completely knock England out of the war, because England, we know today that the British Navy would have retreated from the Mediterranean had Rommel reached the Suez Canal, because they would have wanted to take their navy back to India. So that would have, then we would probably be still talking about a Nazi Europe today, if that had happened. But that's another story. In any event, so Iraq is a crucial piece of that. So they thought, this Iraqi nationalist movement, if we ally with the Nazis against the British, then this will help us in our independence aspirations. And there is this revolution of Rashid Ali. Rashid Ali is this Iraqi fascist who is supported by the Nazis. And there's direct support. This is one of the closest links that we have between the Nazis and the Arab world, is the direct German Nazi support for the revolution, the revolt of Rashid Ali. It's a completely Nazi-backed regime and backed revolt against the British. And he revolts against them and tries to set up a Nazi-backed government in Iraq. And the revolt is crushed. By who? By the British. The British army in the Middle East was pretty strong. Let's take a break from Rashid Ali. I promise we'll get back to him in a minute. I just want to talk about the British military in the Middle East so we understand how the British Empire is operating. Okay? The French have colonies in the Middle East too. Syria and Lebanon are French colonies. Now, when France surrenders, because that's what they tend to do when they're involved in wars, they surrendered in June 1940. Under the terms of the surrender, 2/3 of France, including the entire coastline and all its ports, and its fleet, become under direct Nazi occupation. The bottom third of France is this Nazi puppet collaborationist regime called Vichy France. And one of the clauses of that agreement is that Vichy France, which is still officially independent France, but it's a collaborationist regime, they still control French colonies. Okay, so all colonies are not officially under Nazi occupation. They're still officially French. But what type of French? A collaborationist regime that's accommodating the Nazis. Okay? For instance, Indochina, which is today Vietnam, was a French colony, and that remained under French, right? There's an irony of World War II. Who invaded Indochina during the war? Japan. So if it was under direct Nazi occupation, that would have been invading their ally, correct? But it wasn't officially their ally. They're Lambanan, the Japanese, right? It was under French still. But the problem was that England was very worried about this. Why? Because the main thing that England was worried about at this stage of the war is their navy getting defeated in the Mediterranean, and then the Suez Canal and the Arabian oil fields might come under Nazi control. So, we have to make sure that the British Navy is not defeated in the Mediterranean, right? And here you have, all of a sudden with the fall of France, you have on one side of the Mediterranean, Morocco and Algeria, our French colonies, controlling the Straits of Gibraltar, and the opening of the Mediterranean are now under the French collaborationist regime. And on the other side of the Mediterranean, you have Syria and Lebanon, which are in the heart of the British Mediterranean, right near British-controlled Egypt, British-controlled Palestine, British-controlled Arabia, British-controlled Iraq, British-controlled Jordan, British-controlled Cyprus and all those other islands in the Mediterranean, Malta, right? And here you have Syria and Lebanon are French colonies that now are collaborating with the Nazis. The Nazis can move their navy ships to Syrian and Lebanese ports and attack British shipping from much closer. They can have air force bases in Syria and Lebanon and attack the British much closer. This was very scary for the British. So what did the British do? They made a preemptive invasion of Syria and Lebanon. Most people are not aware that this front of World War II existed. That there was the British army invade Syria and Lebanon and made a military occupation of Syria and Lebanon, which were French colonies during World War II. Where did the British have all these extra soldiers? They're fighting for survival in England. This is when London is getting bombed. Where do they have all these extra soldiers lying around? You know who was the British army who invaded Syria and Lebanon? Subjects of the British colonies in the Middle East. Jordanian, Palestinian, and Jewish. They're wearing British uniforms, fighting for the British military together against the French collaborators in Syria and Lebanon with their, subjects in their army, right? Fascinating situation. So Jordanians and Palestinians and Jews of the Yishuv are all fighting side by side in British uniform. Ever you see a picture of Moshe Dayan, the famous Israeli general? He's got that patch, right? He didn't win that really cool patch by losing his eye in an Israeli war. He lost his eye fighting in Syria and Lebanon wearing a British uniform during World War II. That's how he lost his eye. And that's where he got the patch. So that is, by the way, that was fantastic because all the Jews of the Yishuv got amazing free military training from the British, which helped, all those veterans then formed the nucleus of the IDF. So that worked out, right? God got them some good military training at no expense. So that's the way the British are looking at the Middle East. That's why I brought in that whole story. And that also complicates the narrative that they're anti-British. Many of the Arabs are anti-Jewish, but they're fighting for the British against the French, who are collaborating with the Nazis. It's not as black and white as we would like to think it is, right? But either way, getting back to Iraq, so continuing British policy in Iraq at that time, so the British go ahead and crush the revolt of Rashid Ali. And Rashid Ali has to flee for his life, and that is defeated. There's no fascist regime. And as the revolt is ending, and as the British are trying to solidify their control once again over Iraq, there's a power vacuum, which very often happens in these type of situations. The old regime is defeated, the new one hasn't reestablished itself yet, and there's a power vacuum. And that's when the Farhud takes place, in that power vacuum. There's no good police force yet, there's no laws, it's an anarchy. And why did they take it out on the Jews? First of all, very often in history, when you need an excuse, you take it out on the Jews. But here it is more directly linked. Can we imagine the Jews of Baghdad, who were very successful, very integrated, and very close with their neighbors, very good relationship with their neighbors up until that time, until they were betrayed by them? Were the Jews happy with the revolt against the British? Probably not, because a fascist regime backed by the Nazis, what would happen to the Jews of Iraq in that situation? Not very good, not good prospects, correct? Right? So they're very happy that the British are back. So they're celebrating, they're pro-British. They may have even helped the British with intelligence and spying. They definitely wanted the British to be in charge. So they are allying themselves. Allying this, thank you. Get to learn a little English here with all these educated. Allying themselves with the colonizers. And the whole point of this Rashid Ali revolt was not so much because they loved Nazis so much, it's because they were anti-British and wanted to get rid of the British Empire and fight for Iraqi independence. And here the Jews are helping the British and celebrating the British. And they don't want this Iraqi independence. Ooh. So the Jews are the bad guys. They're on the British side. They're an easy target. And it was easy to blame them. And then this terrible tragedy happens. Now, victims of the Farhud are recognized, and survivors of the Farhud today are considered these quasi-Holocaust survivors. Some of them are still alive. And the victims of the Farhud are considered not exactly Holocaust survivors, but something related to that, something similar to that to that. This victims of Nazi anti-Semitism in the victims of Nazi era anti-Semitism. I want to end off with.
You're saying yourself. You're not sure if really that you had to give the reparations.
It's an indirect link.
Very indirect. I mean,
it's
there's. What's your opinion? Everything's indirect, really.
Right, because it's not even a Nazi collaborator regime at this point. It's a local pogrom that the flames of anti-Semitism were probably because there was this fascist pro-Nazi regime in place that just got defeated. So everyone is riled up anti-Jewish because of the Nazis. The Jews wanting to not have this pro-Nazi regime in place supported the British. So it's related to the Nazi era, but is it directly like the Holocaust? I'm not sure. In Libya, when the Nazis occupied Libya, which was an Italian colony, and Rommel's tanks were in Libya, and they round up Jews in Libya and Tunisia and send them to concentration camps, and some of them died in those concentration camps. They weren't sent to gas chambers. They weren't deported in mass. That I see as a Holocaust victim direct. There's no question about it, right? It's over here. It's a much worse tragedy. It's much more people were killed. It's a horrible story. It's like Nazi era anti-Semitism. I don't know if exactly the Holocaust, but we can certainly say that the Arab anti-Semitism at that time was related to Nazi propaganda, Nazi inspiration, Nazi ideas. That is for sure a direct relation. Okay? I want to end off with something a little more positive. It's good to work against your nature occasionally. And I'll say two good stories about the Arab or Muslim world and the Holocaust. Number one, I lead tours in Morocco, not just in Europe. So in Morocco, we talk about this. The Vichy French controlled Morocco. It was a French colony. The king of Morocco was like this puppet leader underneath the French. And he didn't like the French. He also wanted Moroccan independence, as did most of the Moroccan people. In fact, at the Casablanca conference in January 1942, so Roosevelt promised King Mohammed V of Morocco that colonialism will end after the war, and Morocco and many other countries will get independence. And Churchill's sitting there, like, what are you promising him? So that's a different story. Colonialism in World War II. Roosevelt saw World War II as an opportunity to end colonialism, and Churchill saw World War II as fighting to preserve the British Empire. In other words, to fight for colonialism. But that's a different schmooze for another time.
The British people saw Churchill selling out in the end. That's part of the reason he was voted out.
I thought it was more on the economic side, but I don't know. You have to check those elections. I'm not sure. It could be. What? There you go. King Mohammed V had very little power because the French collaborators were in charge, and there was many anti-Jewish laws passed, and Moroccan Jews suffered from a Nazi collaborator regime. Right? Not that many were killed. There weren't even one or two labor camps. Whatever. Moroccan Jewry during the Holocaust is another story. But what is interesting is that he went out of his way to show that he is not anti-Moroccan Jews, that the Jews of Morocco are part of Moroccan society. He publicly spoke against what the French collaborationist colonial powers were doing. And when he celebrated the anniversary of his coronation, under the Vichy French, the Nazi-aligned regime, he invited, in a formal invitation, the chief rabbis of Morocco, who sat at this, by invitation only, in the Moroccan palace, at these seats of honor, to show that the Jewish community is part of Morocco, and doesn't matter what the French collaborators with the Nazis think otherwise, which I think is a nice thing. Many people go ahead and say that the Moroccan king saved the Moroccan Jewry from the gas chambers. The Jewry was never sent to the gas chamber, so he couldn't have saved them. Had they been, he might have tried to save them. He was a good guy, right? But it's a big step to go ahead and revise history in that direction as well. The last thing I'll say is that there were Muslims living in Europe who occasionally were Chasidei Umot Olam. That also happened. There was an Egyptian doctor living in Berlin during the war. He'd gone to medical school in Berlin, one of the best universities in the world. And he had gone from Egypt, from Cairo, whatever it was, to study there. And he ended up staying there and opening a practice. And he risked his life to save Jews in Berlin during the war, during the Holocaust. Right? Yad Vashem recognizes him. There was several stories of Bosnian Muslim families saving Jews in the Balkans, in that area, southern Europe, during the war, risking their lives to save them. In fact, one Bosnian family, Muslim families. They're not exactly Arabs, but they got the same Muhammad, Fatima, the same type of names and everything. Real Muslims. They risked their lives, saved the Jewish family during the war, recognized by Yad Vashem after the war. And in 1992, when there was all those Bosnia wars and Serbia and Croatia and Clinton bombing everybody on all sides and all that, so their lives were at risk, they and their children. And the family that they had saved lived in Israel and had maintained a relationship with them and brought them to Israel to save them. In other words, they returned the favor 50 years later, which is an absolutely beautiful story. That I think those are the type of stories we should speak more of, instead of trying to find that the Mufti was the one responsible for the Holocaust when he wasn't. We try to find ways that even people different than us and of different religions and of different political beliefs, that sometimes we could help each other and be there for each other, and it can go in both directions. I think that's a nicer story to end with. Thank you.